One night in April of 1919, a middle-aged man named Eric Marth woke up in his bedroom in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because his entire bed was shaking. He saw his wife, Margaret, was lying next to him and she was thrashing around and gasping for air. But Eric didn't panic because he knew exactly what was happening. So Eric and Margaret had moved into this house just a few weeks ago. But pretty much right away after moving in, Margaret had begun having these very intense nightmares that would wake her up almost violently, like what was happening right now. Now, from Eric's perspective, these nightmares she was having looked horrifying, but there really was not any physical risk to Margaret. I mean, she would just have these horrible visceral dreams and kind of shake around, but that was it. And so, like he had been doing the past couple of weeks, Eric just reached over and gently put his hands on his wife's shoulders and began repeating her name very gently over and over again to try to kind of get her out of this trance she was in. And sure enough, a moment later, Margaret, who kind of stopped flailing, she let out this huge gasp, and then she sat up straight and panted for air, and she turned to her husband and she said, "I saw the ghost again." And when Eric heard this, he wasn't like, "Oh my goodness, there's a ghost." Instead, he was just kind of annoyed. And so he did his best to comfort her, but he's just thinking, what in the world is going on here? So a few years ago, Margaret had joined the spiritualism movement, which was a very popular religious movement at the time. And spiritualists thought they could contact the dead. Now, Eric absolutely did not believe in ghosts, and he was pretty sure that Margaret's staunch belief in spiritualism was now effectively causing these nightmares. That it was not the house, it was just her belief system. It was kind of manifesting in these nightmares. However, Margaret felt the opposite. She felt like it was the house itself that was haunted, and it was haunted by a vengeful spirit that attacked her every night in these dreams. Now, Eric, it's the middle of the night, he's tired, he's annoyed, he didn't feel like discussing whatever she believed about this ghost right now. So after she said, "I saw the ghost, I saw the spirit again," he just told her to, calm down, go back to sleep. But on this night, Margaret didn't lie down. She actually turned to Eric and she said, "No, I have to figure out what's going on. I have to figure out who this ghost is and why they're haunting me." A week later, a very resigned Eric sat at his kitchen table next to Margaret, and across from them sat a medium, which is a person who spiritualists believed could talk directly to the dead by conducting a ritual called a seance. The medium began to light some candles, and as they did, they told Eric and Margaret to close their eyes because she was ready to begin the seance, where she would ask the spirit haunting their house what it wanted, and they needed, silence and their eyes closed to do that. So Eric fully believed that this seance would be a waste of time and money. He didn't believe in this stuff at all. But he knew his wife did, and it meant a lot to her, and so he's thinking, maybe this can help my wife sleep through the night again. And so Margaret and Eric did as they were told, and Eric, he closed his eyes, and he listened as the medium began clearly rocking back and forth in her chair and began sort of dramatically calling out to the ghost and telling him to reveal himself. And at first, nothing happened, which was exactly what Eric had expected. But after a minute, Margaret suddenly jumped up from the table and ran out of the kitchen across the living room. And Eric, not knowing any better, just got up and followed her. And Margaret, she ran down the hallway and she threw open a door that led down to their cellar, and she raced down the steps. Now, Eric was doing his best not to ridicule what was happening here and just to play along. But it's like, what is his wife doing? What's happening here? And so as he's chasing after his wife, he starts saying "Honey, what's going on here? Where are you going? What is this?" But she didn't respond. It was like she was on a mission. And then finally, when Eric got down the steps and he's in the cellar, he saw his wife, who was now standing in the middle of the cellar with her arms out wide. And slowly, she began to point to a spot on the floor. And in this really weird and hollow voice with this sort of vacant expression on her face, she told Eric to dig. Now, at this point, Eric was totally freaked out. Not because he believed that the seance had worked or that there was a ghost here, but because his wife genuinely was acting totally bizarre. I mean, she was acting possessed. And even if that was an act, it was a terrifying one. And so he just said no. There was no way he was just going to start digging up the cellar floor. Like, what is going on here? But then the medium came rushing down the stairs as well, and they said that Margaret was in a trance, that the ghost in this house was channeling her, and that basically Eric had to do whatever the ghost said. Suddenly, Margaret's voice cut across the room again, and she said to Eric to dig up the floor. And this time she was more forceful and almost desperate, like, you must do this. And so Eric, he's looking at his wife, he's looking at the medium, like, what in the world is happening here? But he's like, you know what? I don't know what's happening. I'm just gonna dig. I'm gonna do what they tell me to. And so he grabbed a shovel and just began digging up the cellar. And after just a few minutes, Eric's shovel hit something in the ground, something hard. He thought it was just maybe like a big rock or something, but a few minutes later, after he and the medium and also Margaret, who's now come over at this point, they'd kind of cleared off whatever it was, they saw in the ground, what had previously been covered by the earth, was this rotten wooden box. And so he and Margaret and the medium, they pulled it out of the hole and they opened up the lid, and all three of them immediately recoiled, because inside of the box was a human skeleton. And so after a minute of just, again, stunned silence, Eric just looked up at Margaret, who did not seem shocked by what she was looking at. This was like confirmation in some ways. And he says to Margaret, is this the skeleton of the ghost that's been haunting you? And Margaret, with that same hollow voice, like it wasn't her voice, looked at Eric and just said, no. It would turn out, according to the story that has been passed down about whatever happened in this house, that the ghost was a doctor who used to live in the house that Eric and Margaret moved into. And 18 years earlier, this doctor had performed an illegal surgery on a young woman, and this woman had died during this procedure. But again, because this surgery had been illegal, the doctor knew if word of what happened here got out, he would be arrested. So what did he do? He dismembered the girl's body and shoved it into this wooden box, filled the box with quicklime, and then he buried it in his basement. And amazingly, the doctor never got caught for what he did. And so he basically spent the rest of his life feeling very ashamed and guilty. And then finally, when he did die, it was like his spirit couldn't actually rest until he confessed. And so this haunting was basically to get Margaret to go down into the basement and see what he had done. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. One afternoon in April of 1925, a wealthy teenager named Lacey raced his horse around the huge estate where he lived in eastern Hungary and took in all the land that he knew he would inherit someday. He stopped when he reached the gardens on the far side of the estate, but before he could ride his horse into the gardens as he wanted to, a field worker ran up to Lacey and asked him to stop and turn around. The field worker, who was about Lacey's age, explained that Lacey was not allowed to ride his horse through the garden anymore, because the last time he had rode through some flower beds and Lacey's father was really mad about it. And at this, Lacey felt totally exasperated because he was tired of his father always bossing him around. And it embarrassed him to be reminded of this by someone as low class as a field worker. So Lacey's family was part of the noble class. His dad was a baron, and his mother was a baroness, and they lived together in an old castle on this beautiful estate. And for the most part, Lacey loved his noble life, but his father could be harsh and really controlling. And sometimes Lacey dreamed of the day that he would inherit his dad's title, because then he, Lacey, would be in charge of the estate, and he could finally run things the way he wanted. And so Lacey decided he wanted to show his father and this field worker and the other field workers that they couldn't order him around all the time. And so he rode his horse right into the gardens and intentionally rode all over their prized flower beds. Lacey's plan was to head back home and go into the castle and talk to his father about that field worker's rudeness. But when Lacey got back to the castle, he didn't have a chance to even speak to his father, because that whole day his dad was very busy with estate matters. And then that night, his father died of a heart attack. A week after his father's death, Lacey walked through the crowded banquet hall in his family's castle looking for his mother, because he wanted to make sure that she was okay. He and his mom had just gotten home from his dad's funeral, and now they were hosting a reception for everyone who had attended. But Lacey couldn't find his mother anywhere inside of this banquet hall, and with a sinking feeling, he realized there was only one place she could be. So after Lacey's father had died, his mother had gone a little bit crazy. She refused to believe that her husband had died of a heart attack, and instead kept insisting that he had been murdered. More specifically, she thought he had been scared to death, because when she had seen his body for the first time, his facial expression looked horrified, like he was actually scared as he died. Now, the doctor had explained to her that, it was entirely possible that his heart attack came on suddenly and he was scared about what was happening to him, and so, was scared when he died. But the Baroness wouldn't listen. She said this was intentional. Somebody did this to him. And so ever since, she had basically spent all of her time in Lacey's father's bedroom searching for clues about her husband's supposed killer. So now, Lacey left the banquet hall and climbed the stairs up the castle up to his father's bedroom, and just as he suspected, when he knocked on the door, his mom answered, looking totally frantic. Lacey told her to come downstairs and say hello to their guests, but she said no, that she was too busy looking for evidence. Then, before Lacey could say anything, his mom just shut the door in his face. The next 6 months went by basically the same way. Lacey's mother spent all her time locked up in the Baron's bedroom around the clock, and Lacey spent most of his time riding his horse, including in the garden, because he didn't like going home anymore. His mother was now technically in charge of the family estate, but she had really let things go since her husband had died. She basically had not taken up any of the responsibilities that she was now in charge of. And so at this point, Lacey really couldn't wait until he was on his own and in charge of the castle and the estate himself. One night in mid-October, so this is at the 6-month mark from when Lacey's father had died, Lacey ate dinner alone, which was common at this point since his mom basically still refused to come downstairs at all. And then after he ate dinner, Lacey began making his way upstairs to get ready for bed. And as he walked upstairs, Lacey just felt overcome with anger and desperation and just kind of general angst about the current situation. He longed so desperately to just be alone and in charge of the estate. He hated the current setup with his mother in charge but not really doing anything. I mean, the whole estate was just falling apart here. But eventually, despite feeling kind of riled up, Lacey, got into bed and closed his eyes and did eventually begin to drift off to sleep. But right after he had fallen asleep, he was suddenly awoken by this ear-piercing scream that was echoing down the hallway. And he realized it was his mother, and she was screaming for help. And so Lacey jumped out of bed and he raced down the hallway to his father's bedroom. And as he ran, other servants were flooding the hallway, racing towards the room as well. And Lacey, he got to the door, he unlocked it, and he rushed inside. And when he got in there, he saw his mother pointing at the foot of the Baron's bed, and she was saying that a demon had appeared in the bedroom and had loomed over her like it wanted to kill her. And so she told Lacey that the demon had to be what scared his father to death. The demon was the murderer. Lacey's mother looked absolutely convinced here. But Lacey, and really all the servants as well, just kind of collectively sighed, because there was obviously no demon at the foot of the bed here. And his mom clearly had just had a bad dream, or, was just basically acting crazy. And so as the servants kind of, went back to their rooms to allow the family to deal with this, Lacey told his mother to just go back to sleep here. And then he turned and walked back down to his room, feeling completely defeated, because to Lacey, his mom was basically losing her mind here, and he had no idea how he was going to help, or really how much longer this current setup was going to last. But this was awful. On both of the next 2 nights, Lacey woke up yet again to the sound of his mother screaming about a demon inside of the Baron's bedroom. And so by the 3rd morning, Lacey had just had enough. He decided he was going to force his mother out of that bedroom and insist that she come downstairs and eat breakfast with him and just act normal for once. However, when he walked to the Baron's bedroom and knocked on the door to speak to his mother, it was not his mom who answered. It was a police detective. Lacey was stunned, and he walked into the bedroom and saw his mother, who was standing there with two more detectives. And Lacey asked, what's going on here? Lacey's mother explained that she had called the police to help her catch the demon that was haunting her at night and very likely was responsible for killing her husband. And at this point, Lacey thought he might die of embarrassment. I mean, this was unbelievable that now the police were involved. But instead of talking about that, he just begged his mother to please send the police home. They do not need to be here. But his mother refused. She was fully committed to the idea that there was a demon here and the police were going to help her find it. And the police, to be honest, looked like they didn't really know what was going on. They were just kind of trying to figure out if this was serious or not, or if there was some sort of intruder, but they were just kind of like, well, we'll see. And so Lacey finally just turned, left, hopped on his horse, and went for his daily ride. That night, as Lacey crawled into his own bed, he knew that down the hallway, his mom was already in bed, and that 3 detectives were watching over her room in case a demon appeared. Again, Lacey felt unbelievably embarrassed by this. To even be affiliated with this was just excruciating, but he managed to close his eyes and go to sleep. But, like normal, at some point in the middle of the night, he woke up because his mother was screaming. And Lacey, he's like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. It's only getting worse, but he got out of bed, he went into the hallway, and he began walking down towards where his mother was, where she was screaming inside of the Baron's bedroom, expecting that, once again, the room would be empty and the police would see, this is just complete delusion here. There's no demon, there's no problem. However, when Lacey got to the doorway and looked inside, he saw one of the detectives running across the room and then tackle something that really did look like a demon to the floor. And then Lacey's mother turned on the light. It would turn out that even though Lacey fully expected to inherit his father's title, he was actually not the Baron's firstborn son. Before the Baron had met the Baroness, Lacey's mother, he'd had a relationship with a local peasant woman, and they had had a son together. And the Baron had given that peasant woman a plot of land on the edge of the estate to raise their son in secret. And then the Baron had basically abandoned them both. He had given them the opportunity to, work on the estate and sort of make a living for themselves, but functionally, he didn't interact with them at all. He didn't recognize them at all. They were on their own. Now, the peasant woman, the mother of this child, had sort of accepted that this was their reality, but the secret son had sort of buried that feeling forever until Lacey rode his horse through the gardens, despite being told not to, and destroyed those flower beds. Because the secret son was that field worker. His job was looking out for the gardens, and it just felt like a step too far. And so the secret son, the field worker, decided he was going to teach this family a lesson. He was going to kill the Baron and the Baroness by scaring them to death. That was his plan. And it sort of worked. He went into the castle and pretended to be a demon in the middle of the night, and he scared the father, the Baron, so badly, he literally had a heart attack and died. However, the secret son continued pretending to be a demon around the Baroness after killing the Baron, and the Baroness would get really, really scared and would scream and claim there's a demon in here. But she didn't die from this. She did not have a heart attack. And so ultimately, the plan was foiled. And so in the end, there was no demon. It was just Lacey's half-brother wrapped in a cloak, wearing a horrifying mask. One morning in early August of 1927, a 24-year-old woman named Inez Perry walked in the back door of the farmhouse where her parents lived in rural Vermont. And as soon as she walked in, she went into the kitchen where her father was at the kitchen table with a man she had never seen before, and the two were shaking hands, and she heard her father say, "We have a deal." And then right after that, Inez's father looked over and saw her, and he explained that this man's name was Clarence Sinclair, and that he and Clarence had just agreed to swap houses. And for a second, Inez was confused, but then it all clicked into place. So Inez's parents had raised her and her other 3 siblings in this farmhouse, but Inez and her siblings had all moved away, and her parents were getting older. Her dad's health in particular was starting to fail, and keeping up the farmhouse was getting to be too much for him. And so her father had been trying to sell the property for a while, but nobody seemed to want it. However, now it seemed like he had finally found a solution. Her dad explained to her that Clarence and his family would move into this farmhouse and take over the farm. And in exchange, he and Inez's mom would move into Clarence's house just a few towns over. Now, to Inez, this arrangement did seem a little strange, but it also did solve her parents' problem. And so even though she was going to be sad to say goodbye to her childhood home, she decided that this had to be the right move for her parents. And so she said, that's great. A few weeks later, Inez was inside of her parents' new house, helping to get them settled in and organize their living room, when she heard the clattering sound of a horse-drawn wagon coming down the street and coming to a stop right outside. So she walked to the door and she opened it up, but the second she saw who it was that was getting out of the carriage, she slammed the door and locked it. Because the person getting out of that carriage was Clarence Sinclair, the man who Inez's dad had swapped homes with. And the home swap had not gone how Inez and her family had hoped. Inez's parents were thrilled with their new house, so everything on their side was good. But pretty much immediately after actually doing the swap, Clarence had started acting totally unhinged. He had come back to his old home repeatedly without being invited, and he would beg Inez's dad to switch houses back, that he had made a horrible mistake. But Clarence would never elaborate. He would never really explain why he felt this way. He would just, demand, please, I've made a horrible mistake. We have to switch back. But Inez's dad had said no. A deal was a deal, and he just had too many health issues to live at that farmhouse anymore. And Clarence couldn't actually cite any real problems with the farmhouse that he so desperately wanted to, give back. And so as far as Inez's dad was concerned, the subject here was closed. He had not given him a faulty property, and there was no real reason here to go back to the way it was, and so it was a no. So now Inez and her parents watched from the window as Clarence hopped out of his wagon and came rushing onto the porch, and he looked absolutely crazy. His hair was messed up and greasy, and there were dark circles under his eyes, and he really looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. And Clarence promptly began pounding on the front door, shouting that his family could not live in their farmhouse, and that this was now a matter of life and death. But eventually, when Inez and her family refused to come out, Clarence finally gave up, turned around, got in his wagon, and drove away. Now, that was the last time that Clarence came to their house. But it was not the last time that Inez and her family would hear about their old farmhouse. A few weeks later, on November 4th, after several days of very heavy rainfall, Inez picked up the newspaper and saw that their old neighborhood had been basically washed away by historic flooding. And that included their old farmhouse. It had literally been carried off. And the family that had been living in the farmhouse were dead. But that family was not Clarence Sinclair's family. It would turn out that after Clarence and his family had moved into said farmhouse, Clarence began having these horrible dreams where his dead mother would appear to him and tell him to move out of this farmhouse right now because something terrible is going to happen here. Now, at first, Clarence ignored this and chalked it up to a bad dream, but the dream kept happening over and over and over again, and it was driving him mad. And so eventually, he did go to Inez and Inez's parents and tried to switch it back because he felt like this dream really meant something. But Inez's father just kept saying no and said, no, that's your house now. And so Clarence never elaborated to the family about why he wanted this back because it made no sense to him either, but he ultimately listened to his dead mother in his dream, and he wound up just selling the farmhouse just to not live there anymore. And so that decision would ultimately save Clarence and his family. But it would also condemn to death the family who moved in.
On the evening of June 3rd, 2004, a 23-year-old college junior named Jesse Valencia walked into a restaurant in Columbia, Missouri. His friends were already there. They were sitting at a table in the back of the restaurant, and as soon as they saw him, they waved him over. And so Jesse made his way over to sit with them. Jesse was a student at the University of Missouri, and he was majoring in journalism and pre-law. The spring semester had just ended a few weeks ago, and as much as Jesse had loved the semester and he really had enjoyed what he was studying, he was looking forward to some time off. He wanted to see his friends and go to some good parties. Jesse had always been a very outgoing person with a very active social life, but sometimes that characteristic sort of got him in trouble. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, he'd had to go to court over a charge of obstructing a government operation, which he'd picked up 2 months earlier when he refused to leave a house party that the cops were breaking up. And as soon as he sat down at the table with his friends, one of them immediately asked him, hey, how'd that court hearing go? And Jesse had said, it didn't go too well. He thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous, and he had hoped the charge would have been dropped already. But when he had gone to the courtroom, he found out the charge had actually been upgraded. The prosecutor had changed it to obstructing a government operation by physical interference, which was worse. But Jesse said, he still wasn't that worried about it. He said he had pleaded not guilty, and his plan was to fight this thing to the very end, even if it took all summer. However, the reality was this charge was actually the least of Jesse's problems. He had much bigger things weighing on his mind that summer. His longtime boyfriend, Jack Barry, had broken up with him recently, and he was having a very hard time coping with that. Jack had wanted to stay friends, but the reality was, even though, the intention was good, it just made things harder for Jesse, because it meant that Jesse and Jack were still spending quite a bit of time together and still talking and socializing. And while Jack felt like things were over romantically, Jesse didn't feel that way. It just sort of felt like they were perpetually on the verge of getting back together, even though they weren't. And then whenever Jesse would try to talk to Jack about, maybe trying to make things work again, Jack would immediately just turn him down. And so the whole situation was just really difficult. And so without Jack anymore, Jesse had become very lonely. And he had been trying to fill that void with random hookups, meeting guys online and inviting them to the hotel where he worked as a night clerk. But for the most part, it was sort of shallow and didn't mean anything. At one point, Jesse had been having this secret affair with an older man, which had been exciting. But deep down, what Jesse really wanted was just a real relationship, like he had had with Jack. And these random hookups were not that. And so at this point, basically every time Jesse went out socially, no matter what he was doing, he was always kind of on the hunt for somebody who could potentially have, long-term relationship potential. And this night was no exception. And so that night, Jesse and his friends had a nice dinner together. And then when they were done, they left the restaurant and walked a few blocks to a gay dance club called SoCo Club. It was dark and the music was loud and thumping. And as soon as they walked inside, Jesse immediately weaved his way through the crowd on the dance floor over to the DJ booth. He asked the DJ to play his favorite song, which was Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. And the DJ just sort of rolled their eyes. Jesse knew the DJ was very likely annoyed with him because Jesse requested that song every single time he came to this club. But Jesse never had let other people's opinions stop him from doing what he wanted. And so he didn't care. He just wanted the song played. And so after he had made his request, Jesse went over to the bar and ordered a drink. And while he waited, he saw a young man standing alone at the other end of the bar. Once the bartender passed Jesse his drink, Jesse went over and asked the man if he wanted to dance. The man smiled and said, "Sure." And then one dance turned into two, turned into three, and pretty soon the two had spent the whole night together. Now, it was hard to hear each other over the loud music, but over the course of several dances, Jesse had learned that this man's name was Ed McDevitt, and he was training to be a chef. Jesse felt like Ed was a really nice, cool guy, and it seemed like they had an immediate connection. And so when the club closed, Jesse asked if Ed wanted to come home with him. Ed said yes, and after that, Jesse asked his friend Jennifer if she wouldn't mind giving them a ride back to Jesse's apartment. She said of course, and so shortly after that, the trio left the club, they got in Jennifer's car, and they drove back to Jesse's apartment. And when Jesse and Ed got out, Jennifer said, "Hey, tomorrow night I'm having a party at my place. You two should come by." And Jesse, he turned to Ed and kind of winked at him and said, "Yeah, hopefully we'll both be there." And then Jennifer drove off. After Jennifer had driven off, Jesse walked Ed down the stairs to his very run-down basement apartment. And as soon as they went inside, Ed saw this sea of all these history books stacked all over the living room. It would turn out Jesse was really into ancient Greek history. And so Ed began walking around, opening up all these old history books. And as Ed did, Jesse began regaling him with, tales of the Battle of Thermopylae, how the Spartans were outnumbered and how they prevailed, and talking about Zeus and the ancient Greek gods, and just kind of going off all the stuff that Jesse really enjoyed about, ancient Greek history. And Ed, as he listened to it, just said, I really don't know much about history, but it's really fascinating that you're so into it. And so from there, the rest of the night went great for the two of them. They would spend the night together. And then at 10 a.m. the next morning, as Ed was getting ready to leave, they made plans to meet up again at Jennifer's party that night. Before Ed left, he wrote his phone number down on a scrap piece of paper and gave it to Jesse. And Jesse took the paper and then walked Ed to the door and gave him a hug and a kiss before he left. And then once he was gone, Jesse just hoped that, maybe this wasn't just a meaningless hookup. Maybe this had the basis of a strong, long-term relationship. The one thing Jesse really wanted. Around noon that day, Jesse was eating a quick lunch before heading out for work when he heard a knock on his door. He walked over and opened it up, and he saw his landlord standing in the hallway. And his landlord looked pretty mad. He told Jesse that, hey, it's the 4th of the month, and you still haven't paid rent. Jesse apologized profusely and just said, it totally slipped his mind, and he promised he would get it to the landlord that afternoon. But after the landlord accepted his answer and, Jesse shut the door, he couldn't help but have this sort of sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Because the truth was, he didn't have the money. Jesse had grown up in a very poor family in a small town in Kentucky. He was actually the first person in his whole family to go to college, and he had paid his bills by working as a hotel clerk, the same job his mother had had back home. Now, Jesse loved his family, and he spoke to them basically every single day. He would call them all the time. But at the same time, he had always felt so trapped in his conservative, ultra-religious hometown. So he had left and tried to sort of reinvent himself as someone new, the kind of person who can do anything and go anywhere. And so even though he had done that, it would turn out that making real money was something that he just hadn't quite figured out yet. Before Jesse left for work that afternoon, he scrounged up all the cash he could find, but it still wasn't enough to make rent. He dropped the cash in the landlord's mailbox anyway, with a note promising he would get the rest of it together in a couple of weeks. Then he walked to his job at the campus inn and spent an uneventful evening behind the front desk, counting down the hours until the end of his shift. And as soon as the end of his shift came, when the clock struck 11 p.m., he bolted home and immediately changed clothes before heading out to Jennifer's party, where he was supposed to meet his new love interest, Ed McDevitt. However, when Jesse walked into that party, he didn't see Ed. He did a lap around the apartment, checking every room, but he wasn't there. And so Jesse just grabbed a beer out of the fridge and began chatting with Jennifer while he waited. But after a while, he checked his watch and realized that either Ed was running really late or he just was not coming. So, trying to tell himself that it was not quite time to be disappointed, maybe there was an explanation here, Jesse went outside and called the phone number that Ed had written down on that piece of paper that morning. Now, this phone number was for a landline phone, and so, Jesse, he punched it in and he listened and it rang for a few beats, and then somebody picked up, and it was a guy, but it was not Ed. It was somebody whose name was Mark Butler, and Jesse had never heard of this guy, and he asked, where's Ed? And Mark explained that he was Ed's roommate, and that actually Ed was asleep right now. He had to work in the morning, and so he had decided actually not to go to the party, to Jennifer's party. He just wanted to sleep. Now, as Mark was telling him this, Jesse was trying to make sense of okay, is Mark like Ed's boyfriend or something? Are they together, or are they just roommates? And also, Jesse couldn't help but feel like Mark clearly did not want to be talking to Jesse right now. It was pretty clear in his tone that he was trying to just get off the phone. But Jesse was not ready to just, mail it in here. He wanted to see Ed. And so he told Mark, well, hold on a minute. Can you please go wake him up? I need to talk to him. And at first, Mark was like, no, he's asleep. He has work in the morning. He does not want me waking him up. But Jesse was relentless and just begged Mark to please, just for a second, put him on the phone. And eventually, Mark relented. About a minute later, a very groggy-sounding Ed hopped on the phone, and as soon as Jesse heard his voice, he was so excited, and he basically pitched Ed hard on why he should not go to bed and come out to this party, and that he really wanted to see him. And also, hey, bring your friend Mark too. That was fine. Now, it's not really clear if Ed was excited about this idea, but he would eventually say, fine, I'll come out and meet you, and I will bring Mark. When they got there, Mark would only stay at Jennifer's party for a little while before he headed out on his own. But Ed and Jesse, they would stick around until about 2 a.m. And then at that point, they would leave Jennifer's house and go to another party across the street. At around 3 a.m. though, Ed said he really did have to get going. It was so late, he had to get up in the morning, he had to go. And so at this point, Jesse understood that this was reasonable. And so he walked him out to the sidewalk and then asked him if, hey, do you want to come over to my place? But Ed said, no, really, I have to get home. I have to go to bed. However, before Ed did finally leave, the two of them would make plans to see each other in just a couple of days. After Ed had taken off, Jesse wandered across the street to say goodbye to Jennifer, and then after that, he began making the walk to his own apartment. And as he was making this short walk to his own place, he began to think that he didn't want to go home alone. If Ed didn't want to come over, well, he was going to find somebody else who would. And so his first thought was to call his ex, Jack. And so Jesse called Jack a few times, and when Jack did not pick up, after all, it's 3 a.m, and they are no longer in a relationship, it's sort of reasonable that he wouldn't, But at that point, Jesse still wanted to see him, and so he walked a few blocks out of his way to make an actual stop at Jack's apartment. Jesse went right up to the door and banged on it, but nobody came to the door. Jack didn't answer. At this point, Jesse began to wonder if, maybe Jack's out with somebody else right now, and he suddenly felt so jealous. Or worse, maybe Jack is here and he knows I'm here, but he doesn't want to see me and he's ignoring me. After a couple of minutes of standing there and knocking a few more times and still not hearing anything from Jack, Jesse finally gave up and stumbled back to his own apartment, drunk and lonely, and a bit heartbroken. Jesse finally stepped foot inside his apartment and shut the door behind him at about 3:45 a.m. However, right after he'd gotten undressed and flopped down on his bed, he heard a knock at the front door. At 2 p.m. the following day, so Saturday, June 5th, 2004, a college student walked out of an apartment just down the street from Jesse's building, and they were carrying a backpack and a cooler. His friends had just pulled into the parking lot, and they were about to head out for a weekend trip to St. Louis. But while he was loading his stuff into the trunk, he noticed somebody lying in the grass nearby, wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. Now, at first, he assumed, this was just somebody passed out drunk from a crazy Friday night party, which sort of happened all the time in a college town like Columbia. But when he took a few steps closer to be sure this person was okay, he saw flies buzzing around their body. About 30 minutes later, Columbia police detective John Short felt his pager go off. He unclipped it from his belt loop, and he saw there was a message from his boss's phone number that just read 911. Detective Short called his boss right away, and he was given the address for a crime scene just off the University of Missouri campus. Short drove there, parked his car on the curb, and then walked over to the yellow tape that was keeping crowds of worried neighbors away from this crime scene. Another detective, Tim Geiger, waved to Short and led him over to the patch of grass where the victim was lying. It was a young man sprawled out on his back, and he was wearing a pair of light blue running shorts with no shoes, no socks, and no shirt. And across his throat was this very deep gash. The medical examiner was already there, and she was crouched down next to the body, and she told Detective Short that a few things were already standing out to her. She pointed to the bruises that were all over the victim's face, their arms, and their torso. But when she lifted the victim's hands, there were no defensive wounds on them. She told Short that was pretty unusual for a knife attack, where the victims usually got their hands up, trying to defend themselves, and as a result, they got their hands cut up. She also pointed out that the blood had run down both sides of the victim's neck and pooled under his body. But there was no blood at all on the front of his body, which meant he was probably lying down right there in the grass when his throat actually got cut. Finally, the medical examiner pulled back the victim's eyelids and showed Short the hemorrhaging in his eyes, which they both knew was typically a sign of strangulation. And so putting it all together, Short theorized that, the victim's killer had likely choked him out and then laid him on the grass and then slit his throat while he was laying there unconscious, unable to defend himself. The detective looked down at his victim's bare feet and noticed they were covered in dirt, like he had been running at some point outside. Short doubted that the encounter between his victim and the killer began on the lawn where the body was found, and now he just wondered if maybe there had been some sort of a chase here, and that this was just where the killer had finally caught up to the victim. But since there was no ID on the victim, Short had no idea who he was or where he'd been running from. And so Short stood up and stepped away from the body so crime scene techs could load it into a body bag. Just then, another squad car pulled up, and two more officers got out. Sergeant Kenneth Smith and Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was the beat cop who typically patrolled this neighborhood, so another sergeant on scene had radioed for him to come over and see if maybe he could help identify the victim. And so at this point, Short told the crime scene techs to go ahead and unzip the body bag and let Officer Rios take a look. And Rios came over and he looked inside, and after a second, he said that he did recognize this young man. He said it was a college kid that he'd actually arrested at a house party just a couple of months ago. He said his name was Jesse Valencia. And so, less than an hour into his investigation, Detective Short now had a name for his victim and some pretty good guesses about how his victim was killed. His next task was figuring out who might have wanted Jesse Valencia dead. So Short looked up Jesse's address, and he found his apartment building was only a block away. So he walked over there. And while the forensics team went inside the apartment to look for evidence, an officer was posted outside the building to make sure no one came or went until the crime scene was officially cleared. Short walked into the building and headed down the stairs to Jesse's unit. And there, the crime scene tech who was dusting the doorway for prints told him that when they'd arrived, the door was actually already open. And so Short went inside the actual unit and began looking around. There was no blood anywhere, and nothing was broken or overturned, so there was no clear sign of a struggle. But the door being left open suggested that Jesse must have left in a hurry. And this certainly matched Short's theory about the fight between Jesse and this killer starting in one location and ending on the lawn. Short figured that, Jesse must have run out of his apartment in a panic and made it a block away to that grass before his killer finally overtook him. And so as Short began to consider this, he also started to think, okay, well, Jesse, who appeared to be in reasonably good shape for his age, if he was chased down and tackled and killed only a block away from his apartment, it sort of suggested that his killer likely was pretty strong and pretty fast. So we're talking about somebody who is in relatively good shape. That's the killer. At least that's the profile he's developed in his mind. And also, the way that Jesse was actually killed, having his throat cut open so violently, it just seemed kind of personal, which suggested that whoever killed Jesse likely was somebody Jesse actually knew. And so with that in mind, Short finished his sweep of Jesse's apartment and then asked a crime scene tech to prioritize getting access to the cell phone and computer that he saw on Jesse's desk. Then he walked out of the apartment and across the hall to the door of Jesse's closest neighbor, and he knocked. A moment later, a very confused-looking young man poked his head out and asked Short what was going on. Short told him that he was investigating a murder and wanted to ask him a few questions. The young man at first just seemed totally shocked and appalled to be hearing this. But then it was like this look of realization washed over his face. He told Short that the previous night, he had actually woken up to the sound of very clearly two grown men fighting in Jesse's apartment. And one of those men was clearly Jesse, because this neighbor heard Jesse clearly saying over and over again, "No," and "Stop it," to this other man. Now, the neighbor kind of sheepishly said, they didn't actually do anything about this. They actually just kind of banged on their own wall and said, "Hey, stop it over there." And then shortly after that, the noise had stopped, and the neighbor had kind of forgotten about it and gone to sleep, not realizing what he was likely hearing was the beginning of Jesse's murder. The neighbor told Short that when they had woken up that afternoon, he'd actually gone across the hall to apologize to Jesse for being so rude the night before. But the neighbor said he found Jesse's door was open, and he didn't look inside. He felt like that was kind of rude. But what he thought was, okay, maybe Jesse was so drunk the night before, that was part of the reason that he must have been having this fight. And so perhaps he was so drunk, he just forgot to close the door. The neighbor said he did try knocking on the opened door a couple of times, but Jesse never came to the door, and so the neighbor just kind of left it at that and went about their business. And so after hearing this, Detective Short asked this neighbor if he had any idea who the other man was that Jesse was fighting with. But the neighbor said he didn't. Jesse, for the most part, kept to himself, and really the neighbor didn't know Jesse well at all, so he did not know who this other person was. After that, Short thanked the neighbor for the information, then he turned around and headed back inside of Jesse's apartment. And so at this point, Short was convinced that, based on the neighbor's testimony, that whatever fight led to Jesse's death likely did begin in Jesse's apartment. And so now Short just had to figure out who were the people that could have potentially been inside of Jesse's apartment late at night like that. Was this somebody who was a friend, a love interest? Was Jesse trying to kick them out and it spurned a fight? He didn't know, but who were the people in Jesse's life that could have been there late at night? That's what he had to figure out. And luckily, at that very moment, one of the crime scene techs had Jesse's cell phone and he was holding it in the air like he had found something. Now, they wouldn't be able to do a full phone dump until they got it back to the station, and they hadn't even touched the laptop yet. But they had gotten access to Jesse's call logs, and the tech told Short that there was something in there that he definitely wanted to see. Because the last time Jesse used his cell phone, according to this log, it was to call somebody named Jack Barry 7 times between 3 and 3:18 that morning. So right away, Detective Short looked up Jack Barry's information, and he found his apartment's address and saw it was not far from Jesse's, and so he drove right over there. Short knocked on the door, and just a moment later, a young man answered, and he had very red, puffy eyes like he'd clearly been crying. Even though Jesse's body had only been discovered a few hours ago, this young man did not seem surprised at all to see the detective. He told the detective that he had already heard the terrible news a friend had told him. After exchanging niceties and the young man confirming that he was in fact Jack, Short followed Jack into his living room. And as they sat down, Short asked Jack about all those 3 a.m. phone calls from Jesse. Jack looked like he was really struggling to hold it together as he told the detective that Jesse was his ex-boyfriend and Jesse had kept badgering him, Jack, for them to get back together, and Jack didn't want to. And so those phone calls were very likely a product of more badgering from Jack. Jack said the night before, he had been woken up by his phone ringing over and over and over again, and before he could even look at the caller ID, he heard a knock at his front door. And he saw it was the middle of the night, and then he leaned over and saw the caller was Jesse, and he sort of figured that, okay, he's calling me, it's very likely him at the front door, I don't want to see him right now, and so Jack just decided he would ignore Jesse and hope he went away. Now, when Jack said this, it seemed very clear he was sort of reliving that moment in his mind. Like, maybe if he had let Jesse in or engaged with him in some way, maybe Jesse would still be alive. That was sort of the insinuation. But Detective Short was thinking, okay, well, even though he seems like he's being very earnest in telling me this, it does mean that he doesn't really have an alibi. He's basically saying, at the time, Jesse was killed, I was home alone by myself, which was pretty weak. However, before Short could begin to poke holes in the alibi, Jack said that, despite the fact that they had broken up, that he and Jesse were, at least in his mind, still on good terms. In fact, they had spoken just the day before on the phone, before getting all those nighttime phone calls. It was during the afternoon, and during that phone call, Jesse had told him about a new guy he'd met at a club the night before, and his name was Ed McDevitt. That night, Detective Short stood outside of an interrogation room at the police station, watching Ed McDevitt through the two-way glass. Short knew his investigation was moving basically at lightning speed here, but there was still quite a bit of pressure on him to get this case solved even faster, because Columbia was a college town where kids were used to feeling safe, and the murder of a student just a few blocks off campus had sort of shattered that sense of trust. And so, students and parents and, staff of the university really wanted Short to get this thing done. And now, looking at Ed through the glass, Short wondered if maybe this was the killer. Maybe this was the guy. After all, Ed was shaking and fidgety looking. He seemed sort of like an emotional wreck, which could mean, of course, he was just upset because he was connected to the murder victim. That's traumatic. Or it could mean he's hiding something, and now he's about to be interrogated by the police, something that would certainly cause a big emotional reaction. Eventually, Short went inside and sat down across the table, and he asked Ed to explain exactly what he had done the night before. And Ed, in a very nervous, shaky voice, told the detective that he and his roommate, a guy named Mark Butler, had met Jesse at a party a little after 11 p.m. He said he ultimately went back home again around 3 a.m., leaving Jesse on the sidewalk, still very alive and well. Ed said his roommate Mark had actually seen him return to his apartment at 3 a.m., and Ed said when he went inside, he went straight to bed, and then he had gotten up early for work. Ed said he was at work when he got the call from police, telling him that Jesse had been found dead. Detective Short listened to Ed's story and asked a few follow-up questions, and then also took a DNA sample from Ed. And then after that, he told Ed that he was also going to get a warrant to search Ed's home. Ed was already such a wreck that, when Short told him about this, search of his home, Ed didn't even really react. However, when Short left the interview room, despite feeling pretty confident that Ed could absolutely be a suspect, he also went and, followed procedure and looked up Ed's roommate, Mark Butler. And he discovered in the police department system that there was Mark Butler, and sure enough, he had a criminal record. So, overnight, while a forensics team was searching Ed and Mark's home, Short actually brought Mark down to the station for an interview. But in reality, Short wasn't expecting Mark to become this primary suspect here. He just wanted to be thorough and rule out anybody who'd seen Jesse that night, and obviously Mark was one of those people. But almost immediately in their interview, Mark started saying some very odd things. He told Short right out the gate that he did not like Jesse, and actually he said point blank that he didn't really care that Jesse was dead. But he also clarified to Detective Short that, he was just Ed's roommate. He was not seeing him romantically, so this had nothing to do with jealousy. He just did not like Jesse. Mark confirmed that he did see Ed when he returned from the party around 3 a.m., just like Ed had said, but Mark had actually not stuck around. He said that after Ed had come back to the apartment, Mark had left to go on a date of his own, and he actually didn't know what time he got back. And so as he was saying this, Short realized that meant Mark was out and about, sort of unaccounted for, at the same time that Jesse was killed. And so obviously something seemed off about Mark. And so Short took a DNA sample and added Mark to the suspect list. The next morning, Sunday, June 6th, after catching a few hours of sleep, Detective Short gathered his team for a meeting. The mood was tense. Everybody was exhausted and very much on edge from spending nearly 24 hours straight working on this case. But when they went around the room and talked about the flood of leads they'd all followed up on yesterday, it didn't actually seem like they had much to show for it. There were now several suspects in play, but none of them seemed to have a good reason to want to kill Jesse Valencia. Jesse apparently had been hounding his ex-boyfriend Jack about trying to get back together, which Jack did not want, and the multiple late-night phone calls and the knocking on the door unannounced, it just seemed like harassment. So it was possible that maybe Jack had gone over to confront Jesse and things got out of hand. But Jack had told Detective Short that he and Jesse had remained friends after the breakup, and some of the other detectives said that Jesse's friends had said the same thing. The two had remained friends. So it seemed pretty unlikely that things between them would have escalated so much that, somebody got killed. Then there was Ed McDevitt, Jesse's new lover, who had seemed pretty nervous during his interrogation. One of the detectives told Short that while searching Ed's house, they'd found a bag full of chef's knives, and some of them were large and sharp enough that they could easily have been the murder weapon. But Ed worked in a restaurant and was training to be a chef, so owning kitchen knives was hardly a smoking gun. And then as for Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, he did have a criminal past and openly said he did not like Jesse and didn't care that he died. But they'd only met one time, and very likely they would never have seen each other again. So it seemed very unlikely that he would go through the trouble of following Jesse home and killing him. Like, to what end? And so Detective Short was getting really frustrated. He just couldn't make sense of any of these suspects. It was like something was missing here. And so he turned to two of his detectives, Jeff Westbrook and Barbara Cook, and told them to go to some local bars that Jesse frequented and just sort of ask around about Jesse, in case there were other leads that they had not uncovered yet. However, right after Detective Short walked out of that meeting that morning, another detective ran up to him and pulled him into a quiet corner and told him a tip had just come in, and it was so sensitive that they were going to have to keep it under wraps even amongst the investigators. The detective told Short that a friend of Jesse's who lived in St. Louis had called the tip in through Crime Stoppers. He said that he and Jesse chatted online all the time, and that Jesse at one point had told him about a secret affair he was having with an older man. And this older man was actually an officer in the Columbia Police Department. Later that day, so this is Sunday, June 6th, 2004, 2 days after Jesse was killed, Detective Short sat at his desk flipping through printouts of all these online chat logs. And these logs showed conversations between Jesse and the friend of his who had called in the tip that Jesse was having this affair with an officer from Short's own police department. In the chats, Jesse wrote all about this relationship. Jesse had seemed to find it pretty exciting at first, having this police officer come by in uniform and carrying on these secret meetups in the middle of the night. But recently, Jesse had begun to suspect that this police officer was married, and this made Jesse furious. He had told this friend in the chat log that he wasn't going to be someone's other woman. However, to Short's frustration, Jesse never actually named the officer that he was having this affair with. He only ever referred to him as Columbia's finest. And so whoever this mystery cop was Detective Short thought they were the most likely suspect. Because unlike Jesse's other lovers, this officer had something to lose if this relationship went south. If Jesse told anybody about this affair, well, the police officer's career could be on the line because they clearly were carrying on this totally illicit affair while on duty. That's not okay. And also they were using their position and power potentially to actually land this relationship. And then also on top of that, the police officer's marriage would likely be destroyed. But Short also knew that he had to move very carefully here, because now he was investigating his own department, which meant that the killer could literally be in the room with him at any time. And so as he walked through the office to refill his coffee, Short found himself scanning the face of every officer he passed. And he realized there wasn't a single person here he could actually trust. Short brought all the files on Jesse's case into his office, and then he told his secretary to find him a roster of the department's entire staff. Then he locked the door, sat at his desk, and pulled out the records on Jesse's friends who had been interviewed already. And he went down the list himself, calling each and every one of them to dig for more information. Quite a few of them said that Jesse had told them about this cop he was sleeping with. And one of them remembered Jesse referring to this officer as just Anderson. And so when Short's secretary came back with the staff roster, Short began looking through it, and he discovered out of the 200 plus officers in the entire department, there were only 2 officers that had the name Anderson: Brad Anderson and Ted Anderson. And so the next step was trying to figure out if either of them had a connection to Jesse Valencia. And so Short pulled out the records from Jesse's arrest at the house party back in April. And as he flipped through it, he realized Brad Anderson was one of the 3 officers who responded to that party. The pieces fit together perfectly. Jesse and Brad Anderson, the police officer, would have met around the same time that Jesse began messaging his friend in St. Louis about this secret affair with a cop. And so at this point, Short felt like he had just found the killer. So he grabbed a manila folder off his desk, stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. Then he did a lap around the whole station, and eventually he spotted Brad Anderson in the locker room, chatting with a few other officers as he put on his uniform. Now, Short wanted to be very careful here, because if Brad Anderson was the killer, he certainly didn't want him to realize he was under suspicion right now. So Short waited in the hallway until Brad walked out of the locker room, and then as casually as possible, Short caught up with him and pulled him aside. Short opened up the manila folder he had brought with him and showed Brad a photo of Jesse Valencia, asking if he recognized him. And Brad squinted at the photo for a second, and then after thinking, he said, "Yeah, that's the kid I arrested at a party a few months ago." Short asked Brad if he had seen Jesse at all since the arrest. And Brad nodded and said, yeah. He said that about a month ago, Jesse had called in a noise complaint, and Brad had been the one sent out to check on it. But by the time Brad got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only there for a couple of minutes before leaving. And that was it. To Short, nothing about Brad's demeanor seemed nervous or suspicious. In fact, it really seemed like he didn't have any clue why the detective was asking him about Jesse Valencia. So if he was the killer, it seemed like he was going to be very hard to crack. Short was about to let Brad go and just wait to talk to him once he had more evidence, but just then, Brad's partner, Officer Rios, walked by. And when he walked by, he looked over and he saw the manila folder with Jesse Valencia's photo inside of it that Short was showing Brad Anderson. And Rios, without even thinking, made this comment under his breath that was clearly directed at his partner. It was like this really in bad taste comment where he was like, "Oh, looks like your gay lover's dead." When Short heard this, he practically sprinted back to his office. Brad Anderson sort of shrugged off the comment made by Rios about, Jesse being his gay lover, but Short felt like what Rios said was a pretty big deal, because even though, again, it was terrible in bad taste humor, that's a terrible thing to say, but maybe there's truth there. Maybe Rios knows that Brad Anderson was seeing Jesse Valencia. Maybe they really were in a relationship. Now, in the moment, Short did not, aggressively follow up on that comment and demand to know if Brad had actually been in a relationship with Jesse before he died. Instead, all 3 of them just kind of went their separate ways, and Short, hustled back to his office. And when he was in his office, right as he sat down, there was a knock on the door. And when the door opened, it was Short's secretary. And she told him there was someone who had been waiting to see him. And then she let in this very nervous-looking young man who introduced himself as Jesse's friend. and he said his name was Andy Schermerhorn. Andy sat down and told Short that just a few weeks earlier, he and Jesse had gone out together and then gone back to Jesse's apartment. But around 3 a.m., they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jesse went to answer it, and a uniformed police officer walked in, shining a flashlight. And to Andy's surprise, Jesse led this officer right into the bedroom, and he joined them for a threesome. And then after they were done, the cop told Andy, "You better keep this a secret." Detective Short couldn't believe it. I mean, the final piece of evidence he needed had just fallen into his lap. Andy said he did not know the officer's name. So Detective Short got out a department yearbook and told him to flip through it to see if maybe the guy he saw that night was in there. But Andy just held up his hand and said he didn't need to do that. And Detective Short was like, "Well, what do you mean? Why can't you do that?" And Andy said, "Well, because when I came in here, the guy I met, he was out in the hall." Based on the investigation that would follow this revelation, the following is what happened to Jesse Valencia in the early morning of June 5th, 2004. Around 3 a.m., right around the time that Jesse was leaving his friend Jennifer's party, Jesse's killer was drinking beers with a few friends after work. And then, just before dawn, the killer wrapped up, got in their car to drive home. But as they were driving, they decided to make a stop along the way at Jesse's apartment. They were expecting another quick, no strings attached, late night secret hookup, but when they got there, Jesse was very drunk and in a terrible mood. Jesse told the killer that he had figured out they were married, and so now he was not interested in them at all. He didn't want to see him anymore. But when he told the killer to leave and the killer refused, Jesse said, "Fine, I'll go to your police chief and I will tell them about our affair." And that's when the killer snapped. If their secret got out, it would cost them everything. So in their mind, they had to silence Jesse before he could ruin them. Jesse tried to run, but he only made it about a block before the killer caught up with him, wrapped an arm around his neck and put him in a vicious chokehold until his body went limp. And then the killer laid Jesse out on the grass, took out a pocket knife, and brutally slashed his throat. And then, on the way home, the killer very skillfully disposed of the murder weapon, ensuring nobody would ever find it, because they knew the knife was the only piece of hard evidence that could ever link them to the murder. After that, they made their way back home, parked in the driveway, and as they were walking up to the front door, they looked up and saw their wife in the kitchen window, preparing a bottle for their baby son. And then just before going inside, the killer unpinned the name tag on their uniform that said Anderson, and they swapped it for another name tag that they had hidden in their glove box. And this name tag was the killer's real name, Officer Steven Rios. Rios was Brad Anderson's partner. He was the one who identified Jesse's body at the crime scene and made that awful comment about Brad Anderson's gay lover. It's believed that Officer Rios was lying to Jesse about his name, and in fact, he actually stole the name tag not of Brad Anderson, but of the other Anderson, Ted Anderson. He was using his name tag and parading around like he was him whenever he was with Jesse. Rios was arrested, and in May of 2005, almost a year after Jesse's murder, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. But after an appeal, he got a new trial, and the charge was reduced to second-degree murder. However, he was still found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.